The Gilded Age, a time of rapid industrial growth, glittering wealth, and deep social inequality. But when it came to the federal government, it was a different story. In today's video, we're diving into an era where presidents were forgettable, big business ran wild, and America began to look beyond its borders. This is the story of laissez-faire government in the Gilded Age and the quiet power of state governments and economic expansionism. Let's get started. From 1876 to 1884, three Republican presidents took office: Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, and Chester A. Arthur. Together, they represent a string of administrations often referred to as the forgettable presidents. It's not exactly a flattering nickname, but in many ways it fits. These leaders were known less for bold action and more for preserving the status quo. Politics during the post Reconstruction period became something of a national sideshow. The federal government focused mostly on basic functions: delivering the mail, keeping a standing army, handling foreign affairs, and collecting tariffs and taxes. To be fair, James Garfield barely had a chance to make his mark. He was assassinated just 6 months into his presidency. But overall, these administrations reflect a larger reality. Federal leadership during the Gilded Age was marked by inaction and deference, a hands off approach that mirrored the prevailing political philosophy of the time. Here's something that might surprise modern audiences. During the Gilded Age, Americans expected very little from their federal government. Instead, real political energy lived at the state and local levels. More than 60% of government taxing and spending was conducted by state and local authorities. Big cities spent more on services than the federal government did, and three out of every four public employees worked not in Washington, but for states and cities across the nation. From building schools to paving streets and enforcing laws, state governments were the engines of political innovation. They were far more dynamic and responsive than the sleepy national government. Meanwhile, America's economy was undergoing a revolution. The late 19th century brought massive social and economic change, and at the center of it all was big business. Monopolies and trusts grew rapidly, dominating industries from oil to railroads. Some citizens, especially farmers, workers, and small business owners, began calling for federal regulation, but Washington wasn't interested. Instead, lawmakers leaned into laissez faire, a principle rooted in the writings of economist Adam Smith and championed earlier by Thomas Jefferson. It's the idea that the government should stay out of the economy, that the best way to ensure growth and prosperity is to let natural market forces do their thing. As Jefferson once wrote, the government is best which governs least. This approach meant that while massive corporations expanded their power, the federal government largely looked the other way. Leaders hoped that state governments would step in to regulate when necessary, but in reality, most states lacked the power to challenge big business. Still, pressure from the public was building, and eventually, even Congress couldn't ignore it forever. But that's a story for another video. Foreign policy in the 19th century? For most Americans, it wasn't a major concern. As one senator put it, the nation had only languid interest in international affairs. The real priorities were domestic: building railroads, settling the West, and fueling the industrial boom. But as the century drew to a close, something shifted. Business and political leaders began to argue that continued industrial growth required new markets and new sources of raw materials. With the western frontier declared closed, expansionists, often called jingoes, revived the dream of manifest destiny. This time, they looked beyond the continent. The first big move came in 1867 when Secretary of State William H. Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. At the time, many laughed at the deal, calling it Seward's folly or Seward's icebox. But the joke didn't age well. In the 20th century, the discovery of oil and other resources revealed that Seward's bargain was one of the best land deals in American history. Then, in 1878, the U.S. struck a deal with the island nation of Samoa. In exchange for trade concessions, the United States received rights to a naval base at Pago Pago. Not long after, Britain and Germany negotiated their own treaties with Samoa. The rivalry eventually led to a peace conference in Berlin in 1889, establishing a tripartite protectorate over the islands, shared by all three powers. The Gilded Age was a paradox. On the surface, the federal government seemed inactive, even invisible. But behind the scenes, its policies or lack thereof laid the groundwork for the rise of corporate power, state led innovation, and America's tentative first steps onto the global stage. It was a time of change, not through legislation, but through inertia, ideology, and ambition. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.